Okay, where were we? We were talking about frequency-dependent selection. And again, that's where, depending on how frequent your particular phenotype is, that can determine your level of selection. A phenotype that's very common in the population might be more prone to predation because it's easier for predators to find. And therefore, selection may actually favor being the less common phenotype. And this was an experiment with birds using a touchscreen in which they did this kind of experiment. Some kind of variation simply has no advantage. It's just there. We saw that with genetics. There's a lot of this repetitive DNA and that kind of stuff that's just kind of there. It's variation, but not really doing much. All right, here's a very fascinating area, sexual selection. And this has to do with mating and how there are certain characteristics, sometimes called these secondary sexual characteristics, that are the result of sexual selection. Okay. Sexual selection sort of comes in two types. There can be selection among individuals for mates, and this typically has to do with males competing with each other for access to the females. And there can be selection which is sometimes referred to as female choice. That is, the females are choosing the males that are most appealing to them. Often this female choice leads towards extreme phenotypes in males because they're trying to advertise themselves, like in these peacocks, and you can see the male pheasant here with these brightly colored feathers. It's thought that the female choice over time has driven the males towards these extreme phenotypes in order to stand out and be chosen. And if you look at something like these feathers, it's also thought that they are basically an indicator of having good genes, because these extravagant feathers and colorations, as you might imagine, make these males more vulnerable, particularly to predation. So in order to withstand that predation pressure, they must have good genes to do that. And these traits exhibit or tell of these good genes. Now, we should make it clear that natural selection, directional selection, however it occurs, it doesn't mold perfect organisms. Organisms are typically well adapted to their surroundings, but they're not necessarily perfectly adapted, and that can be due to historical constraints. And what we mean is that there's only so much genetic variation within the population for evolution to operate on. It could be that evolution would take that population to a particular extreme, but the variation to get there just does not exist. And often traits are used for multiple tasks. And so selection will drive that trait in a particular direction based on the tasks it's being used, but again, it can only go so far because that trait is used for other tasks. Let's look at some examples here. So in penguins, well, let's look at the seals here, or the elephant seals here. So they are primarily an aquatic organism, but they live on land, so they mostly have traits that allow them to be good swimmers, like in these sea lions here. These front flippers are used for swimming, but they also use them for walking on land. They're better for swimming than walking on land, but they have to do both, so it could be that selection could cause them to be even better for swimming, but again, they have to be able to use them for walking on land, so it's sort of a trade-off there. And I don't know about the penguins here. They use their wings, again, for swimming as opposed to flying, so selection has made them much more streamlined and smaller. Okay, so what about sexual selection itself? It's said that sexual selection has a cost. And here's the cost, in that when you have males and females, only half of the individuals can produce new individuals, that is, the females. The others, the males, cannot. Whereas in an asexual population, where basically everyone is a female, all individuals can produce offspring. So as you can see, in a given number of generations, an asexual population can produce a lot more offspring than a sexual one. And so evolutionary biologists have wondered, okay, well, why does sexual reproduction even exist if there's this reproductive cost? Well, you can probably imagine why that is. It's due to that genetic variation. As we know, sexual reproduction is good at recombining the genome and not just producing clones and giving you lots of variation amongst the offspring. And this gives you certain advantages when it comes to surviving, resisting disease, resisting predators, whatever the case might be. And so, I don't have a slide for this, but when evolutionary biologists have looked at family trees of large groups of organisms, you'll often see little pockets of asexually reproducing types, but again, they tend to be more rare, and it's thought through evolutionary time they don't persist because of this cost of everyone being very similar or the same. And so selection essentially does favor groups that reproduce sexually. So again, you can't fashion perfect organism because of these historical constraints. Again, jack of all trades, adaptations are used for different things. There's a certain randomness to natural selection. And again, selection can only work on the variation that is there. Okay, that's it for chapter 23.